Hi, I just made a review on the new 480Hz 1440p monitor from Asus, and something I really wanted to talk more about in that video was the specifics of what differs when aiming on 480Hz versus 240. But it would have bloated the script so much that it may as well have become another full main channel video, and I still might make that video in the future, but for now I wanted to talk about the topic in a more casual style here. My main motivation for making this is that there really isn't an in-depth look at what changes at those absurdly high refresh rates. Everyone knows it gets smoother, but what difference does that actually make for your ability to aim? Of course it gets better, but what skills are impacted the most? And then that thought got extended in the other direction. How about 240 versus 120, 120 versus 60? How badly do lower refresh rates limit you? How much of a benefit do higher ones provide? And what is the best value for money in terms of aiming performance? To find that out, I first had to go back to 60Hz. And just for my first impressions, oh my god, I forgot how bad it actually is. It's not just how choppy everything looks visually. No matter what setup I'm using, it feels like I'm dragging my mouse through mud since everything is so delayed. While flicking was still possible, it felt more like I was guessing than actually adjusting to the target, but I could still do it. Tracking was just not happening. More specifically, while tracking targets making longer strafes was surprisingly not awful on this refresh rate, anything with rapid direction changes, or honestly any direction changes at all, was so much harder than on anything higher. I think the biggest reason for both of those downsides is that movement reading as a skill was just rendered impossible. On higher refresh rates, when a target changes direction, there is enough time to process it decelerating before it starts accelerating in the other direction, which gives you time to make adjustments based off it. For example, on Airvoltaic Bot 3, this bot feels significantly easier on 240Hz compared to 120, just since it's so much easier to read the changes the bot makes to its own trajectory mid-direction change through that acceleration. On 60Hz though, those are all mushed into a single screen refresh, or so few refreshes that I can't read the deceleration as a gradient of speed, but instead a few jagged points of disconnected information. This actually affects other parts of aiming as well. Reading a target's deceleration is important for knowing where to micro-adjust to in a game like Valorant. Is the target continuing their wide swing or coming to a full stop, or will they change directions and try to strafe tool me? And without that information, it really does feel like I'm just hoping the enemy moves the way that's most optimal for me, instead of observing what they're doing and reacting accordingly. Going back to flicking for a second, my initial flick accuracy only got a bit worse, relatively speaking, but my overall consistency in flick scenarios plummeted. Static was terrible, and even target switching took a pretty massive hit compared to 120. What was happening here is that I had to make a full stop after each flick to process where it had actually landed before I could make an adjustment to the target. I couldn't even attempt to blend a flick and micro adjustment together, and even if I did land the flick dead on in like a static scenario, I still had to hesitate since I wanted to confirm I was on target before shooting. Even seemingly unrelated skills like pre-aiming actually changed a fair bit on 60Hz too. Since I wasn't able to register when someone was peeking as fast, I had to hold a bit further out from the angle, and holding pixel peaks wasn't consistent at all. Between all of those downsides, honestly, 60Hz is not worth considering as a viable resolution for high-end competitive play anymore. If you absolutely have to play at 60Hz, it's not worth quitting over, but you should definitely be looking to upgrade as soon as you're able if you're serious about performing well in competitive FPS. Especially since 120Hz is so cheap nowadays, I think it's what most people should be shooting for as a minimum, and if you are still on 60Hz, the upgrade will be night and day. Which brings me nicely onto how 120Hz differs, and to cut to the chase, it was basically a universal improvement. Everything was so much smoother, both enemies' movements on my screen and my own mouse movements. 60 to 120 is the biggest upgrade out of the 4 jumps in Hertz I'll be talking about, and you really do feel the difference in your gameplay. The benefits in performance were so universal that I think it's more interesting to talk about what changed the least, which was acceleration reading and smooth tracking. Acceleration reading was possible now, there were frames to pull the information from, and I could start to make out variations in different animation tells in games, but there still wasn't enough frames to properly grasp the difference between a deceleration into an upwards direction change versus a downwards one on that scenario I mentioned earlier. I was still just sort of aiming in the middle and hedging my bets. As for smooth tracking, I was able to identify the speed the target was going at faster, and having more consistent visual information that not only was 1, the target continuing to move in the same direction, and 2, I was actually moving my mouse at a consistent speed was helpful, but in practice it translated to a much lower relative score improvement compared to looking at reactive tracking, for example. And on that note, it was so much better. It felt like reactively tracking instead of just guessing where the target would go. I had enough time to process each change in direction before the target would change again, and in games like Apex, this made a massive difference. Probably the biggest jump in any single category for any 2 refresh rates. Like I said, I do think 120Hz is the baseline these days for esports titles. I wouldn't want to, but if I really had to, I could go back to 120Hz and still perform at a good level, and it won't limit you nearly as much as 60Hz. If you play FPS as a side hobby with friends, this is probably where I'd stop, but if FPS games are your focus and you're okay spending a bit more money to get a much better experience playing them, or want to push yourself to compete at higher levels, if 120Hz is that baseline, then 240Hz is the standard for high level play in FPS games these days. I don't think there are any pro players with anything below this, and people talk about 240Hz as highly as they do for good reason. This was my baseline when testing other refresh rates out when writing this script. Everything was viewed in reference to this, since, at least to me, this is where motion becomes properly smooth. It varies based on aiming styles, but for some of them, particularly styles more focused on smoothness and clean adjustments, 120Hz absolutely makes it harder to chain those motions together fluidly, since you aren't getting the visual feedback you need fast enough to transition from one movement to the next without any hesitation in between. Just to really quickly set up a concept, the faster and more harsh your mouse movements, the more motion you'll see on screen, obviously, but that extra motion causes more motion blur. So something that happens a lot when trying to take my time with shots is that I will reach the target, but in that time taken, they will have moved slightly. On 120Hz, I couldn't react to their player model movement while I was making mine due to that motion blur, so I had to flick faster to compensate, which was less consistent. On 240 though, it's possible to read their player model's movements while the screen was moving, so flicking more slowly was now way more reliable, and my success wasn't dependent on the enemy not moving. I think this is part of the reason why calm aim has become such a big phenomenon in Valorant. It is basically the pinnacle of that more flowy style I mentioned earlier, and as more people are trying out these faster displays, they've realized how viable it can be. I think that reduced motion blur is the biggest component of why 240Hz feels so much better than 120Hz. Being able to better make out details while your screen is in motion is a core feature of so many aiming techniques that are almost essential to being at a top level. Movement reading, animation reading, flick consciousness, even micro-adjusting fluidly post-flick all rely to some extent on motion clarity, and 240Hz is when I feel like I can finally implement these to a high standard instead of having to find workarounds. As always, reactive tracking benefits the most. 120Hz was very punishing on this category since I either had to force snappy micro adjustments to minimize the time the screen was blurred for, which was inconsistent for me, or take my time and try and track the target's motion visually through the screen's blur. While it was doable, even one overshot micro adjustment would send me into a chain of correcting for my missed corrections that would compound upon itself due to the added motion blur from the extra screen movements from those corrections. On 240Hz, that is still possible, but much less common. I found mistakes a bit less impactful and easier to recover from, and the margin of error is increased a fair bit. So this is as far as you realistically need to go. You can be a top aimer or esports player on 240Hz still, and while you are at a slight disadvantage compared to people at high refresh rates, it is pretty slight, and I know that some of my 240Hz scores are not only better than a lot of other people on 360Hz plus displays, but also better than I could get right now on 480, simply due to the time I had put into getting those scores. Considering the prices you can get these monitors at now, I think they're well worth the investment and make games feel a lot more fluid, even if it's not a comp FPS. 240Hz won't hold you back, but I wanted more. Before I talk about 360Hz though, I have to mention just how good 240Hz OLED is. Even though the visual smoothness is still the same as on any other panel, the motion clarity, what I was talking about earlier that is such a big benefit when trying to aim at a high level, is incredible here. Each individual frame has next to no ghosting, and honestly I would buy one of these monitors over a 360Hz IPS monitor. Part of that is that I do more than just play FPS on my PC, but even just for gaming, If I can't get 240 FPS in a game, I wouldn't get the benefits of a 360Hz monitor, obviously, but I still would get better motion clarity from that 240Hz OLED. They also help a lot for seeing through visual clutter in games like Apex. Even though the clutter is still bad, it doesn't smear into future frames, and my targets felt a lot more in focus despite everything happening around them. Depending on your specs and what games you play, these monitors are absolutely worth considering over something higher hertz with a worse panel for their motion clarity benefits alone. But you can also get OLED 360Hz monitors for pretty reasonable prices now, and conventional 360Hz displays have been going down a lot in price too. Does that refresh rate actually make it? I've already talked about this, yes. For comp, FPS, and aim training, 100%. I'm going to go against the grain here. I think it is more than a slight upgrade. I think it's pretty significant when comparing 240 versus 360 on IPS or OLED. Diminishing returns still apply and all, but I don't know how people don't notice the difference. I talked a bit about acceleration reading earlier. To me, this refresh rate is when a target's acceleration actually becomes that smooth gradient I talked about. Instead of getting a series of images you kind of have to puzzle their rate of acceleration out of, you just feel it. This made a massive difference in tracking. Air scenarios in Kovacs felt much easier, but even more reactive scenarios or situations in game benefited a lot here. I felt like I could react a good bit faster on 240Hz and had more confidence in my adjustments thanks to that visual smoothness and clarity. And on 480Hz, this actually got improved further still. For that type of aiming, it really does feel like every bit of clarity and extra visual information matters. The biggest thing I noticed about 480Hz is that the motion clarity was so good I didn't have to maintain good technique on my micro adjustments anymore. Even if they were a bit shaky or harsh, my target didn't blur and it didn't impact my reading. Of course, I still want to aim with proper technique, but everyone messes up at some point, and when I did on this display, it wouldn't cause those chain reactions that ruin runs or get you killed. This actually translated into tac shooters as well. I found Valorant quite punishing to aim in before, since any shaky adjustments would often translate into those over-adjustment chains, especially when nerves got factored in. And I noticed this gets a lot easier on 480 versus 360 actually. I was able to get away with poor aiming technique more often. And while 360Hz was already great for reading targets' movements in my peripheral vision, I noticed that when moving my mouse and visually tracking the movements of enemies, I would struggle somewhat. Which didn't happen on 480Hz. In dynamic clicking scenarios in Kovacs, I'm much more able to hold the locations of all the targets in my mind at once, since there isn't any blur cluttering that information, and there was enough certainty in that information that I could adjust based solely on my peripheral vision. So I was able to consciously track a target while aiming for a completely different one with way more confidence. I'm sure this is doable on lower refresh rates, but I'm quite simply not good enough, but I can on this display, so yeah. But I kind of skipped over 360 there, didn't I? That's because these two things are the only places that 360 and 480 noticeably differ. 480 is still better in every other area, of course, but I don't think its benefits in like smoothness or target switching over 360Hz are very noteworthy. At least on the OLED panel I use for testing. This could differ on LCD panels since the base motion clarity isn't as good, but I can't test that for the moment. Everything I'm going to talk about next is considering both 360 and 480 together compared to 240. Like I said, the two aren't quite equal and 480 is still definitely better, but they're close enough here for me to bundle them. Even though my flicking accuracy didn't get much better when going from 240 to 360 or 480, my scores actually did improve a decent bit in scenarios that were primarily flicking. I think mainly because of a concept I call flick consciousness, which just means how quickly you can identify where your flick is going to land. Unlike at lower refresh rates, at 240Hz it's possible to tell at the latter part of your flick if you've overflicked or underflicked, partially off of feel, but mostly from visual feedback. The benefits of this is that you can tell which direction you need to micro-adjust in and potentially even start that movement before your flick has landed, leading to much better fluidity between targets overall. This is especially true if you slow down at the end of a flick to have cleaner stops and is actually one of the benefits of that flicking technique, but that's beside the point. On 240, there was still a bit of delay between my movements on static scenarios, but that mostly vanished on anything higher. The delay wasn't the only part of the movement that got significantly better though. The other piece of the puzzle was my micro adjustments themselves. Not only were my transitions into and out of micro adjustments smoother thanks to that boost in flick consciousness improving my fluidity, But I was able to correct for errors in my micro adjustments much faster if needed, even mid-micro adjustment sometimes. I also felt a lot more consistent making them overall. There was no guesswork needed in terms of the location of the target I was adjusting to. So those were all the major differences I noticed between 240 and 360. It doesn't sound like that much, but like I said, I do think it's noticeable and helped in every aspect of aiming. Those were just the ones that stood out to me as being more significantly improved and worth talking about. The real question is then, is it worth the money? And I think this is something only you can answer really. Starting with 360, I think if you take FPS games seriously and can get that frame rate, it probably would be. Especially if you're looking into an OLED panel, the benefits over a 240Hz IPS are massive and it's a really nice upgrade. For Aim Trainer mains specifically, if your goal is to push scores, I don't know if you could get a score you couldn't on 240, but you will get those scores quicker on 360. If it's something that's within your budget and pushing yourself to your limits in terms of aim is your goal, I think it's worth the money. As for 480 though, I think unless you really want to be on the cutting edge of smoothness and motion clarity or exclusively play Valorant, Overwatch and Aim Trainers, I think it's a lot harder to justify in terms of the aiming improvement it will give you. Like I said in the main video, I could go back to 360Hz without too much trouble, but I do really like 480 and there absolutely is a difference in performance between these two refresh rates. The reason it's so hard to recommend is just the price. $1,000 is a lot and a lot more than 360Hz. Even though I think it's good value for what you're getting, it's very hard to justify. Unless you want to get a monitor you'll not need to upgrade for like 5 years or just have a lot of money to invest into this hobby, or if it's your job instead of a hobby, it's probably better to go with a 360Hz one or wait until the prices come down a bit. Monitor technology, especially OLED technology, is progressing really fast, and there's a decent chance that something faster comes out and causes the prices to become a bit more manageable. I'd also like to mention that if you are looking for a monitor like this at this price range, I think you should absolutely be looking at a 1440p OLED instead of a 540Hz Zowie or other 1080p LCD high refresh rate panels. I'm sure they're great, and I've enjoyed using the 360Hz one when I got to try it, but for a monitor at this price, you want it to be future-proof, the best of the best. And 1080p on a TN panel just isn't. If you play Valorant at like 1000 FPS and really want that backlight strobing tech, then maybe, but otherwise I think the OLED is much better value. Thanks for watching, and I hope this was helpful to someone, either for, informing a purchase or just, hearing discussions of different aim tech that I might have made you aware of or helped solidify your understanding of. Yeah, thanks for watching. See you in a month or so.